The morning sun painted golden streaks across the tall glass windows of First National Bank as the clock struck 9:30. Inside, the usual Tuesday rush was in full swing. People in crisp suits hurried past marble columns, their expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. The air hummed with the quiet energy of money being moved, loans being approved, and dreams being either built or broken. Behind the customer service counter, 24-year-old Lisa Chen straightened her navy blazer and prepared for another, ordinary day. She had been working at the bank for just 8 months, still eager to prove herself in her first real job after college. The morning had started like any other, helping customers with account questions, processing loan applications, and maintaining the professional smile she had practiced in front of her bathroom mirror. That's when the automatic doors slid open, with their familiar whoosh, and everything changed. An elderly black man stepped through the entrance, moving slowly but with quiet dignity. His clothes told a story of hard work and modest means: faded blue jeans with honest patches, a clean but worn flannel shirt, and work boots that had seen countless miles. What caught everyone's attention, though, was the large burlap sack he carried against his chest, holding it like it contained something precious. Samuel Washington was 73 years old, though the lines on his weathered face suggested he had lived through more than his fair share of struggles. His hair was completely white, kept neat and short, and his dark eyes held a mixture of determination and sadness that spoke of old wounds and long-carried burdens. As Samuel made his way across the lobby, conversations began to quiet. The morning rush of customers couldn't help but notice this unusual figure. A woman in a designer handbag whispered something to her companion. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced up from his phone with raised eyebrows. Even the security guard, a middle-aged man named Officer Rodriguez, shifted his attention from the morning newspaper to this unexpected visitor. Samuel approached Lisa's counter with measured steps, the burlap sack never leaving his careful grip. When he reached the polished marble surface, he looked directly into Lisa's eyes with a gentle but serious expression. "Good morning, young lady," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of decades but remaining respectful and clear. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge here. It's about this building." Lisa blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the directness of his request. She had handled hundreds of customer inquiries, but something about this man's presence felt different. There was no anger in his voice, no demands or threats, just a quiet certainty that made her pay attention. "I'm sorry, sir, but could you be more specific about what you need help with today?" Lisa asked, maintaining her professional tone while trying to process the situation. "Are you looking to open an account, or do you have questions about our services?" Samuel shook his head slowly, his grip on the burlap sack tightening slightly. "No, miss. I'm not here about banking. I'm here because this building sits on land that belongs to my family, has for over 100 years. The words hung in the air like smoke. Lisa felt her professional smile waver as she tried to make sense of what she had just heard. Around the lobby, she noticed that conversations had stopped entirely. Even the soft background music seemed to pause. I'm not sure I understand, sir," Lisa stammered, her training manual having never covered a situation quite like this. "Are you saying you have some kind of property dispute?" "Not a dispute, Samuel," replied calmly. "A fact. My grandfather owned this land fair and square, and it was stolen from our family. I've got proof right here." He patted the burlap sack gently, as if comforting an old friend. By now, the unusual conversation had drawn the attention of everyone within earshot. Mrs. Patterson, a regular customer who came in every Tuesday to make her weekly deposit, craned her neck to get a better look. Two young professionals who had been discussing their weekend plans now stood frozen, their conversation forgotten. Lisa felt her cheeks growing warm as she realized she was becoming the center of a very public and very strange situation. Her supervisor had always emphasized the importance of handling difficult customers with grace, but this didn't feel like a typical difficult customer situation. Samuel wasn't yelling or making unreasonable demands. He was simply stating something. That sounded impossible. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion," Lisa said, trying to keep her voice steady. This building has been owned by First National Bank for many years. Perhaps you're thinking of a different location? Samuel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but disappointment. It was the look of someone who had heard these words many times before. No confusion, miss. I know exactly where I am. Been walking past this spot for 70 years, watching what they built on my family's land. He gestured toward the marble floors and towering ceilings. My grandfather used to run a general store right here, fed half the families in this town during the Depression. The security guard, Officer Rodriguez, had been listening from his post near the entrance. Something about the old man's story tugged at his memory. His own grandfather had told him stories about the old downtown area, about businesses that used to exist before the modern buildings went up, but those were just stories, weren't they? Lisa glanced around the lobby, noticing that what had started as curious glances had turned into open staring. She could see her co-workers behind the teller line exchanging worried looks. This was exactly the kind of situation that could spiral out of control if not handled properly. I understand this is important to you, sir, Lisa said, trying to strike a balance between respect and authority. But I think you might need to speak with someone else about property records. Maybe the county courthouse would be a better place. To start? Samuel nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. I've been to the courthouse, miss. Been to a lot of places over the years. But this is where it all started, so this is where I need to be. Behind Samuel, the lobby had filled with an uncomfortable tension. Some customers were checking their watches, clearly annoyed by the delay. Others seemed genuinely curious about what would happen next. Mrs. Patterson had given up any pretense of minding her own business and was openly listening to every word. Lisa felt trapped between her duty to help customers and her growing sense that this situation was beyond her ability to handle. She glanced toward the manager's office, hoping to catch someone's attention who might know what to do. That's when Margaret Thornfield emerged from the executive area, her expensive heels announcing her approach with sharp clicks against the marble. Margaret was 45 years old with perfectly styled blonde hair and a navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. She had built her career on being decisive, authoritative, and unflappable in any situation. But as she approached the customer service counter and saw Samuel standing there with his burlap sack, something in her confident stride faltered for just a moment. Maybe it was the way he stood so calmly despite being the center of attention. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in his weathered face. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a whisper of recognition that she couldn't quite place. What seems to be the problem here? Margaret asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Samuel turned to face Margaret with the same calm dignity he had shown Lisa. Despite the expensive suit and intimidating presence of the bank president, he didn't seem nervous or intimidated. Instead, he nodded respectfully, like he was greeting an old neighbor. "Good morning, ma'am," Samuel said quietly. "I'm Samuel Washington. I've been trying to explain to your staff that this building sits on my family's land." Margaret's eyebrows shot up, and she couldn't help but let out a small laugh. It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it came out that way. Around the lobby, a few customers chuckled along with her. The idea seemed so ridiculous that it was almost funny. "Mr. Washington, I appreciate you coming in today, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Margaret said, her voice taking on the tone she used when explaining things to difficult customers. "This property has been owned by First National Bank for decades. We have all the proper documentation." Samuel didn't flinch at her dismissive tone. Instead, he carefully set his burlap sack down on the marble counter. The sound it made was heavier than anyone expected, like it was filled with something substantial. "I understand why you'd think that, ma'am," Samuel replied. "But sometimes what people think they know isn't the whole truth." Margaret glanced around the lobby, noticing that their conversation was drawing more attention. A few more customers had gathered, and she could see her employees whispering among themselves. This was not the kind of scene she wanted in her bank. "Mr. Washington, perhaps we should discuss this privately," she said, thinking it would be easier to handle him away from the growing crowd. "That's fine by me," Samuel agreed. "But first, I want everyone here to understand something." He raised his voice just enough so the whole lobby could hear him clearly. My grandfather, Ezekiel Washington, bought 12 acres of land right here in downtown back in 1898. Paid cash for it, got the deed legally, built a business that fed families during the hardest times this town ever saw. The lobby fell completely. Silent. Even Mrs. Patterson stopped pretending to count her deposit money and listened openly. Samuel continued, his voice steady and clear. In 1943, while my grandfather was overseas fighting for this country in World War II, some people in this town decided they wanted his land. They made up fake tax bills, forged documents, and ran my family out of town when we tried to fight back. Margaret felt her confident smile starting to slip. There was something in Samuel's voice that didn't sound like the ramblings of a confused old man. He spoke with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "Mr. Washington," Margaret interrupted, trying to regain control of the situation. "These are very serious accusations you're making. Do you have any proof of these claims?" Samuel's weathered hands moved to the burlap sack. "Yes, ma'am. I've got proof. Took me 40 years to gather it all. But I've got it." He began to untie the rope that held the sack closed. Margaret found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't understand why. Around the lobby, everyone seemed to lean forward slightly, as if drawn by some invisible force. The first thing Samuel pulled out was a manila folder, old and worn, but carefully preserved. He opened it gently, like he was handling something sacred. Inside was a document that looked ancient compared to the modern papers most people were used to seeing. "This is the original deed," Samuel said, holding it up so Margaret could see, "signed and sealed in 1898. Ezekiel Washington, my grandfather, paid $300 cash for 12 acres of prime downtown land." Margaret stepped closer despite herself. The document looked genuine. The paper was the right age, the ink had faded in the way old documents do, and the official seals appeared authentic. But that didn't mean anything, she told herself. Documents could be forged. Anyone can make a fake deed, Margaret said, though her voice lacked the confidence it had held moments before. Samuel nodded as if he had expected that response. "You're right, ma'am. That's why I brought more than just one piece of paper." He reached back into the sack and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some so old they were printed on thick cardstock that felt substantial in your hands. "These are pictures of my grandfather's store," Samuel said, spreading several photographs across the marble counter. "The Washington General Store right here where we're standing now." Margaret leaned over to look at the photographs, and her breath caught in her throat. The images showed a busy street scene from what looked like the 1920s or 1930s. There was indeed a general store, with Washington's painted clearly on the front window. But what made her stomach drop was the background of the photos. She recognized the street. She recognized the buildings on either side. She even recognized the old oak tree that still stood in the small park across the street. These photographs were definitely taken right here, right where the bank now stood. "This doesn't prove anything," Margaret said, but her voice was weaker now. "Lots of businesses used to be downtown before urban development." Samuel reached into the sack again and pulled out a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. "These are letters my grandfather wrote to lawyers, trying to get help when they stole his land. And these," he said, pulling out another bundle, "are copies of the fake tax documents they used to justify taking his property." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she picked up one of the tax documents. It was a notice claiming that Ezekiel Washington owed back taxes on his property. Taxes that were supposedly overdue by several years. But as she read more carefully, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The signature at the bottom of the document belonged to Harold Thornfield, her great-grandfather, the man whose portrait hung in the bank's main conference room, the man whose family had founded First National Bank. "Where did you get this?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel's expression softened when he saw the recognition in her eyes. "From the county records office. Took me months to find them, buried in old files that nobody had looked at for decades. But they're all there, ma'am. Every single document that shows how they stole my family's land." Margaret felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. She had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandfather, about how he had built the bank from nothing. about his contributions to the community, but she had never heard this side of the story. This Harold Thornfield, Samuel continued gently. He was your family, wasn't he? Margaret couldn't speak. She just nodded. Samuel reached into the sack one more time and pulled out a folder that looked different from the others. It was newer, with typed pages instead of handwritten documents. I hired a private investigator 5 years ago, Samuel explained. Cost me most of my savings, but I needed to know the whole truth. This folder contains bank records, property transfers, and correspondence between your great-grandfather and several other men in town. They planned the whole thing, ma'am. They wanted to clean up downtown, and that meant getting rid of the black-owned businesses. Margaret opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were photocopies of letters written in her great-grandfather's handwriting. As she read, her face grew paler with each page. The letters talked about solving the problem of black property ownership downtown. They discussed specific strategies for creating legal justifications to seize land. They even mentioned the Washington property by name. One letter, dated 1942, made Margaret's stomach turn. In it, her great-grandfather wrote to another city leader. The Washington situation presents an excellent opportunity. With the old man away at war, we can move quickly on the tax issue. Once we have the land, we can begin construction on the new financial district. The lobby had been quiet during this exchange, but now Margaret realized that several customers and employees had moved closer, trying to see what was happening. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a secret she had never known she was keeping had been revealed for everyone to see. I don't understand, Margaret said weakly. If this is all true, why didn't your family fight it in court back then? Samuel's expression grew sad. They tried, ma'am, but in 1943, it wasn't easy for a black family to find lawyers willing to take on the white establishment. And when they did try to fight, things got dangerous fast. My family received threats. Someone burned down my grandfather's temporary store on the outskirts of town. Eventually, they had to leave for their own safety. Margaret looked around the lobby and realized that everyone was staring at her. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed shock, and a few showed something that looked like dawning understanding. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly regular customer, was nodding slowly as if pieces of an old puzzle were finally fitting together. I remember my daddy talking about the Washington store, Mrs. Patterson said suddenly, her voice carrying across the now silent lobby. He used to say it was the best place to get supplies during the hard times. Said old Mr. Washington would let people pay when they could, never turned anyone away hungry. Other murmurs began around the lobby. It seemed like Samuel's story was awakening old memories in some of the older customers. Margaret felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her as she stood frozen behind the customer service counter. The lobby had transformed from a normal Tuesday morning rush into something that felt more like a courtroom. Every person present seemed to be waiting for her response to Samuel's devastating revelations. I think we need to discuss this privately, Margaret said, her voice barely steady. She could feel sweat forming on her forehead, despite the bank's perfectly controlled air conditioning. Samuel nodded respectfully. That's probably best, ma'am. But I want everyone here to know that I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just want the truth to come out after all these years. As Margaret led Samuel toward her office, she could hear whispers spreading through the lobby like wildfire. She caught fragments of conversations, people talking about old stories they'd heard, questioning things they thought they knew about the town's history. Margaret's office was a monument to success and tradition. The walls were lined with awards, family photos, and historical pictures of the bank's founding. Her mahogany desk dominated the room, polished to a mirror shine and organized with military precision. Behind her chair hung a large portrait of the bank's founding fathers, including her great-grandfather Harold Thornfield. Samuel entered the office and immediately noticed the portrait. He stood quietly for a moment, studying the face of the man who had changed his family's destiny forever. That's him, Samuel said softly, pointing at Harold Thornfield's painted image. I've seen that face in old newspaper clippings for years. Always wondered what kind of man he really was. Margaret felt uncomfortable under Samuel's gaze as he looked between the portrait and her face. She could see him noting the family resemblance, the same jawline, the same determined expression that had served the Thornfield family well in business. "Please have a seat," Margaret offered, gesturing to the leather chairs in front of her desk. She needed time to think, to process what was happening. Samuel carefully placed his burlap sack on the floor beside his chair and settled in comfortably. Despite being in the intimidating office of a bank president, he seemed completely at ease. "Mr. Washington," Margaret began, trying to regain some control of the situation. "Even if some of these documents are authentic, you have to understand that we're talking about events that happened over 80 years ago. The legal landscape has changed completely since then." Samuel smiled sadly. "You're right about that, ma'am. The law has changed a lot. But theft is still theft, no matter how much time passes." Margaret opened her laptop and began typing quickly. "Let me pull up our property records. I want to see exactly what we have on file about this building's history." As her computer searched through decades of files, Samuel reached into his sack again. "While you're looking, ma'am, let me show you something else that might interest you." He pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling. "This belonged to my grandfather," Samuel explained. "He kept detailed records of everything, every sale, every customer, every payment he made on his property taxes. Real organized man, my grandfather was." Margaret glanced up from her computer screen as Samuel opened the journal. The pages were filled with careful handwriting and faded blue ink. "Here," Samuel said, pointing to a series of entries from 1942. "These show every tax payment my grandfather made before he left for the war. Paid 6 months in advance just to be safe. But somehow the city claimed he was behind on his taxes." Margaret leaned forward to read the entries. The handwriting was neat and precise, with dates, amounts, and receipt numbers carefully recorded. It was exactly the kind of documentation that would hold up in any modern court. Her computer finished loading the property records, and Margaret's heart sank as she read through the files. The official record showed that the land had been acquired by the city in 1943 for unpaid taxes, and then sold to a development company owned by Harold Thornfield and 3 other prominent businessmen. "According to our records," Margaret said slowly, "the land was purchased legally from the city after it was seized for tax default." Samuel nodded. "That's what the official records say, but I've got the real story right here." He reached into his sack and pulled out a manila envelope that looked newer than the other documents. "Remember I told you about that private investigator? Well, he found something very interesting in the state archives." Samuel opened the envelope and spread several photocopied documents across Margaret's desk. "These are internal memos from the city tax office dated 1943. They were never supposed to become public, but they got mixed up with some other files that were donated to the State Historical Society." Margaret picked up the first document and began reading. It was a memo from the tax assessor to Harold Thornfield, dated 3 weeks before Ezekiel Washington's property was officially seized. The memo read, "Harold, the Washington situation is proceeding as planned. We will issue the delinquency notice next week, regardless of his payment history. The war provides perfect cover. By the time he returns, if he returns, the transfer will be complete and irreversible." Margaret's hands began to shake as she read. This wasn't just about illegal property seizure. This was about a conspiracy that involved her own family at the highest levels. "There's more," Samuel said gently, sliding another document toward her. This one was a letter from Harold Thornfield to the city mayor discussing their urban renewal project and specifically mentioning the need to relocate the colored businesses to more suitable areas outside the downtown district. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Everything she had believed about her family's legacy was crumbling before her eyes. The bank that had been built on principles of community service and ethical business practices had actually been founded on stolen land and racial hatred. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered. "Why didn't anyone know about this? Why didn't it come out years ago?" Samuel's expression was patient, like a teacher explaining something to a confused student. "Because powerful people wrote the history, ma'am, and they wrote it to make themselves look good." He pulled out another document, a newspaper clipping from 1943. The headline read, "City develops downtown properties, new financial district to bring jobs and progress." See this article? Samuel pointed to the text. It talks about the abandoned properties that were being developed. Makes it sound like the land was just sitting empty, waiting for someone to make it useful. Margaret read the article and realized it never mentioned Ezekiel Washington or his store. It never mentioned that a thriving business had been destroyed to make way for the new development. The story had been carefully crafted to hide the truth. "My grandfather tried to fight this when he came back from the war," Samuel continued. "But by then, construction had already started on the new buildings, and every lawyer he talked to told him the same thing. Too much time had passed, too many important people were involved, too dangerous to pursue." Samuel reached into his sack one more time and pulled out what looked like a small wooden box. Inside were military medals and commendations. "These belonged to my grandfather," Samuel said with obvious pride. "He served with honor in Europe, earned a Bronze Star for bravery, came home thinking he'd fought to protect American freedom and justice. Instead, he found out that the very people he'd been fighting for had stolen everything he'd worked for." Margaret stared at the medals, imagining what it must have felt like for Ezekiel Washington to return home to find his life's work gone. "What happened to him after that?" Margaret asked quietly. Samuel's voice grew heavy with old sadness. "He never really recovered. Tried to start over in another town, but his heart was broken. He'd believed in the system. Believed that if you worked hard and followed the rules, you'd be treated fairly. When that belief died, something inside him died too." Margaret looked up at her great-grandfather's portrait again, seeing it with completely different eyes. The confident expression that had always seemed admirable now looked cruel and calculating. "Mr. Washington," Margaret said slowly, "if all of this is true, and I'm beginning to believe it is, what exactly are you asking for? What do you want from the bank?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, as if he was carefully choosing his words. "I want recognition, ma'am. I want the truth to be acknowledged, and I want justice for my grandfather, even though he's been gone for 20 years now." Margaret's phone began ringing on her desk, but she ignored it. Outside her office, she could see her employees trying to manage the curious crowd that had gathered in the lobby. Word of Samuel's visit was clearly spreading beyond the bank's walls. "I need to ask you something honestly," Margaret said. "Do you have legal representation? Are you planning to sue the bank?" Samuel smiled for the first time since entering her office. "I've been talking to some lawyers, yes, ma'am, but I didn't come here to threaten anyone. I came here because I believe in giving people a chance to do the right thing before involving the courts." Margaret realized that Samuel was offering her an opportunity, a chance to address this situation before it became a public legal battle that would destroy both her family's reputation and the bank's future. "What would doing the right thing look like to you?" Margaret asked. Samuel leaned back in his chair and looked thoughtful. Margaret's phone had been ringing non-stop for the past hour. She sat in her office staring at the documents Samuel had left behind, trying to process everything that had happened. Samuel himself had left quietly after their conversation, saying he would give her time to think about what they had discussed, but thinking was becoming impossible. Her assistant knocked on the door for the third time in 20 minutes. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm sorry to bother you again, but there's a reporter from Channel 7 News in the lobby. They're asking about some kind of property dispute, and the phone hasn't stopped ringing. People are calling about a story they heard." Margaret's heart sank. She had hoped to have more time to figure out how to handle this situation, but it seemed that Samuel's visit had already created ripples that were spreading far beyond the bank's walls. "Tell the reporter I'm not available for comment right now," Margaret said, "and hold all my calls unless it's an emergency." But even as she said it, Margaret knew it was too late. In today's world, news traveled faster than she could think. Someone in the lobby that morning had obviously started talking, and now the story was taking on a life of its own. By late afternoon, Margaret's worst fears were confirmed. The local evening news led with a story titled, "Elderly Man Claims Downtown, Bank Built on Stolen Land." The report was brief but devastating. It included interviews with several people who had been in the bank that morning, including Mrs. Patterson, who spoke about her father's memories of the old Washington General Store. Margaret watched the newscast from her office, feeling sick to her stomach as the reporter stood in front of the bank building, describing Samuel's claims. They had even managed to get a brief interview with Samuel himself, conducted outside his modest home on the other side of town. On camera, Samuel appeared calm and dignified, just as he had in her office. When asked about his motivations, he said simply, "I'm not looking to hurt anyone. I just want the truth to be told about what happened to my family." The reporter had also spoken with a local historian who confirmed that there had indeed been several black-owned businesses in the downtown area during the 1930s and 1940s that had mysteriously disappeared during the urban development boom of the post-war years. Margaret's phone started ringing again almost immediately after the newscast ended. This time it wasn't reporters calling. It was members of the bank's board of directors. The first call came from Robert Mitchell, the board chairman and one of the bank's largest shareholders. His voice was tight with anger when Margaret answered. "Margaret, what in the hell is going on? I just watched the news and saw some old man claiming he owns our building. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding that you've already sorted out." Margaret took a deep breath. "Robert, I wish I could tell you that, but the situation is more complicated than it appears. The man has some very convincing documentation." "Documentation can be faked," Robert snapped. "I don't care if he has 100 pieces of paper. We have clear title to that property and we've had it for decades. This is obviously some kind of scam or shakedown attempt." "I don't think it's a scam," Margaret said quietly. "I've seen the evidence, and I've done some preliminary research into our own records. There are some things that don't add up." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. When Robert finally spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Margaret, I want you to listen to me very carefully. This bank has been serving this community for over 70 years. We employ 200 people. We hold mortgages for half the families in town, and we manage millions of dollars in assets. I will not let some confused old man destroy everything we've built based on papers that are probably forgeries." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you suggesting we do?" "I'm suggesting you hire the best lawyers money can buy and make this problem disappear. Quickly." After Robert hung up, Margaret sat in her darkened office, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She thought about Samuel, about his quiet dignity and his grandfather's military medals. She thought about the documents she had seen, the careful handwriting in Ezekiel Washington's journal, the damning memos that revealed her great-grandfather's involvement in what could only be described as theft. Her computer chimed with a new email. It was from the bank's head of legal affairs with the subject line "Urgent Property Dispute Analysis." Margaret opened it with trembling fingers. The email was brief and to the point. "Margaret, I've done a preliminary review of the situation based on news reports. We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning. This could be a serious problem if the claims have any legal merit. I'm reaching out to our external counsel tonight." Over the next few days, Margaret felt like she was living in a nightmare that kept getting worse. The story had been picked up by regional news outlets, then by national media. Social media exploded with discussions about historical injustice, corporate responsibility, and the legacy of racism in American business. The bank's lobby, once a quiet place of business, became a gathering point for protesters and supporters on both sides of the issue. Some people carried signs supporting Samuel and demanding justice for historical wrongs. Others held signs defending the bank and questioning Samuel's motives. Margaret found herself trapped in her office most days, unable to walk through the lobby without facing angry questions from customers and reporters. The stress was taking its toll. She wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly, and felt like she was under siege. The board of directors called an emergency meeting for Thursday morning. Margaret walked into the conference room to find 12 very serious faces staring at her. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Robert Mitchell didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Margaret, our legal team has finished their analysis of this situation. The news isn't good." David Chen, The bank's head attorney opened a thick folder and began reading from his notes. Based on the documents that have been made public and our own internal research, there's a strong possibility that the original property acquisition in 1943 was legally questionable at best and potentially criminal at worst. Margaret felt her stomach drop. What does that mean exactly? It means, David continued, that if this Mr. Washington has additional evidence that supports his claims, he could potentially have a valid legal case for recovering the property. Property law in cases of fraud and illegal seizure can be very complicated, but there are precedents for returning land to families even decades after the original theft. Board member Janet Rodriguez leaned forward. Are you telling us that this man could actually take our building? David nodded grimly. In a worst-case scenario, yes. If he can prove that the original seizure was fraudulent, and if he can establish a clear chain of ownership from his grandfather to himself, he could potentially claim ownership of not just the land, but everything built on it. The room erupted in angry voices. Board members talked over each other, demanding to know how this could happen, why no one had known about this potential problem, and what could be done to stop it. Robert Mitchell slammed his hand on the conference table. Enough! David, what are our options for fighting this? David looked uncomfortable. We can challenge the authenticity of his documents, though our preliminary analysis suggests they appear genuine. We can argue that too much time has passed for such claims to be valid. Though recent court cases have shown that fraud exceptions can overcome statute of limitations issues, we can claim that we were innocent purchasers who had no knowledge of any illegal activity. And what are the chances of success with those arguments? Margaret asked. David was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, not good. Especially with the current legal climate around historical injustices and corporate responsibility. A jury today would be very sympathetic to Mr. Washington's story. Janet Rodriguez spoke up again. What about public relations? This story is making us look terrible. Our stock price has already dropped 15% this week. Margaret had been thinking about this aspect too. Every day brought new protests outside the bank. Social media was full of people calling for boycotts of the bank's services. Several large corporate clients had already called to express concerns about continuing their relationships with the bank. The PR situation is bad and getting worse, Margaret admitted. But I'm more concerned about what's right than what looks good. Robert Mitchell stared at her in disbelief. What's right? Margaret, we have a responsibility to our shareholders, our employees, and our customers. What's right is protecting this institution. Even if this institution was built on stolen land? Margaret asked quietly. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Margaret as if she had said something shocking. That was over 80 years ago, Robert said finally. We can't be held responsible for things that happened before most of us were even born. Margaret thought about Samuel's grandfather, about a man who had served his country with honor only to come home and find his life's work stolen. She thought about decades of injustice that had been buried and forgotten by everyone except the family that had suffered from it. Maybe we can't be held responsible for what happened then, Margaret said slowly. But we can be held responsible for what we do now that we know the truth. Robert's face turned red with anger. Margaret sat alone in her office that evening, long after the rest of the bank employees had gone home. The building felt different now. Every marble column, every polished surface seemed to carry the weight of secrets that had been hidden for too long. She stared at her great-grandfather's portrait, wondering how many other families had been hurt by decisions made in rooms just like this one. Her phone buzzed with another text message from Robert Mitchell. It was the 5th one that day, each more demanding than the last. This one simply read, Board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. We need your decision on how to handle the Washington situation. Time to end this. Margaret knew what that meant. The board wanted her to authorize an aggressive legal response, challenge every document, question Samuel's motives, and drag the case through court for years until he either gave up or ran out of money to fight. It was the corporate playbook for dealing with inconvenient truths. But something had changed in Margaret over the past week. Maybe it was seeing Samuel's quiet dignity in the face of decades of injustice. Maybe it was reading her great-grandfather's letters and realizing that her family's fortune had been built on cruelty, or maybe it was simply recognizing that she had the power to do something right in a world that often seemed determined to do wrong. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bank early. Before the board meeting, she wanted to take one more walk through the lobby to see the building through Samuel's eyes. She stood where his grandfather's store had once been, trying to imagine what it had looked like when it was full of families buying groceries and neighbors sharing news. Mrs. Patterson arrived for her usual Tuesday deposit, moving slowly with her walker. When she saw Margaret, she approached with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Thornfield, I hope you don't mind me saying something, but I've been thinking about that gentleman who was here last week. My father used to talk about the Washington store all the time. Said Mr. Ezekiel was the kindest man in town, always helping folks who were struggling." Margaret nodded. "What else did your father say about him?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes grew distant with memory. "He said when the store disappeared, it broke something in the community. People had to travel miles to find another store that would treat them fairly. My father always wondered what happened to the Washington family, whether they were okay. Did your father ever mention anything about how the store closed?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. "He said there were rumors. Talk about city officials and some of the wealthy families making deals behind closed doors. But people were afraid to say too much back then. Different times, you know." Margaret felt a deep sadness settle in her chest. Samuel's family hadn't just lost their property. They had lost their place in a community that had depended on them. The board meeting was as difficult as Margaret had expected. Robert Mitchell started by announcing that he had hired one of the state's most aggressive corporate law firms to handle the Washington case. "They specialize in property disputes," Robert said confidently. "They think we can tie this up in court for years, maybe even get it dismissed on technical grounds." David Chen, the bank's attorney, looked uncomfortable. "Robert, I should mention that 3 more families came forward yesterday with similar claims about downtown properties. This could become much bigger than just the Washington case." The room fell silent. Margaret felt a chill as she realized that Samuel's courage in coming forward had inspired other families to share their own stories of stolen land and buried injustices. "All the more reason to fight this aggressively," Robert said. "We can't let every person with an old document think they can shake us down." Margaret had heard enough. She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every person's stare. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. "We're not going to fight Samuel Washington in court." Robert's face turned red. "Margaret, you can't be serious. This could destroy the bank." "Fighting him could destroy us too," Margaret replied. "But more importantly, it would be wrong. I've seen the evidence. I know what my great-grandfather did, and I won't be part of covering it up any longer." Board member Janet Rodriguez leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm proposing that we acknowledge the truth about how this land was acquired. I'm proposing that we work with Samuel Washington to find a fair resolution that honors his family's claim, while also considering the reality that this bank employs 200 people and serves thousands of customers. That's financial suicide," Robert said bluntly. "If we admit wrongdoing, every lawyer in the state will be lining up to sue us." "Maybe," Margaret said. "Or maybe honest acknowledgement of past wrongs is the first step toward building something better." The board voted. When the final count was tallied, it was 8 votes against Margaret's proposal and 4 in favor. Robert Mitchell looked satisfied as he announced the result. "Margaret, the board has spoken. We fight this case with everything we have. I hope you can support that decision." Margaret looked around the table at people she had once considered friends and colleagues. "I can't support it, Robert, and I won't." She walked out of the conference room and went straight to her office. Within an hour, she had typed her resignation letter. By noon, news of her resignation had reached the local media. That afternoon, Margaret did something she had never imagined she would do. She drove to Samuel Washington's house. Samuel lived in a small but well-maintained home in one of the older neighborhoods. The front porch was decorated with potted plants, and Margaret could see through the window that the inside was clean and organized, filled with family photos and books. Samuel answered the door with surprise, but invited her in graciously. They sat in his modest living room, surrounded by pictures of his children and grandchildren, and Margaret told him about her resignation and the board's decision to fight his claim. "I'm sorry they chose that path," Samuel said sadly. "I was hoping we could work something out without lawyers and court battles." "We still can," Margaret said. "Mr. Washington, I want to help you tell your story. I want to make sure people know the truth about what happened to your family." Samuel looked at her carefully. "Why would you do that? It could make things harder for you." Margaret thought about that question. "Because it's right, and because I think my great-grandfather would want me to fix what he broke if he could see the pain it caused." Over the next several months, Margaret worked closely with Samuel and his legal team. She provided access to the bank's historical records, helped authenticate documents, and even testified about her family's involvement in the original land seizure. The case received national attention as more details emerged about the systematic theft of black-owned properties in the 1940s. Other banks and corporations began examining their own histories, and several chose to voluntarily return properties or provide compensation rather than face public trials. The board of directors at First National, facing overwhelming evidence and public pressure, finally agreed to settle with Samuel. But the resolution was unlike anything anyone had expected. Samuel didn't want to destroy the bank or put people out of work. Instead, he proposed creating something new. The settlement established the Ezekiel Washington Community Trust, with Samuel as the legal owner of the downtown property. The bank would remain as a tenant, but with new leadership committed to community investment and social justice. Margaret was invited to serve as the trust's first executive director. Her job was to use the property's value to create affordable housing, support minority-owned businesses, and fund educational programs about local history and civil rights. The transformation wasn't easy. Some longtime customers left the bank in anger. Some employees struggled to adapt to the new mission. But gradually, something beautiful began to emerge. The bank's lobby became home to a small museum displaying the history of the downtown area, including stories of all the families whose properties had been stolen. Samuel's grandfather's store was recreated in one corner, complete with vintage fixtures and old photographs. Young entrepreneurs, many of them from families that had been pushed out of downtown decades earlier, began opening new businesses in buildings owned by the trust. The area became a vibrant example of how communities could address historical wrongs while building toward a better future. Samuel, now recognized as one of the most respected figures in town, often spent his afternoons in the lobby, sharing stories with visitors and school groups. Children would gather around his chair as he told them about his grandfather's store, about the importance of standing up for what's right, and about how one person's courage could change everything. Margaret found a peace in her new work that she had never felt during her banking career. Every day brought opportunities to help families build wealth, support community dreams, and create the kind of downtown area that served everyone fairly. The old burlap sack that Samuel had carried into the bank that first day now sat in a place of honor in the museum. Next to it was a plaque that read, "Truth like justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever." People came from across the country to see what had happened in this small town, to learn how a community had chosen healing over hiding, justice over convenience.